Let's take a look at the Baroque era. This era lasted from around 1600 to about 1750. During this era, the Catholic Counter-Reformation occurred. This was the Catholic Church attempting to overcome or to compete with the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation had removed church decoration. At the opposite extreme, the Catholic Counter-Reformation went overboard. At least it went to the other end of the spectrum in terms of decorating churches, intending to invoke awe. So that was one of the purposes of church decoration in the Baroque. As far as the rules, they broke the rules when it came to the use of Greek and Roman forms. They used them in non-traditional ways. What they did was they combined columns and then invented new shapes like volutes and medallions. This is described in the lectures on this era. One of the rules also was to create theatrical and dramatic effects. Now, as far as technology goes, it's kind of up to you to fill that in. By this time, technologies for painting had been well developed, as well as for sculpture and architecture. So pretty much what happened in terms of technology was a continuation of the prior eras, taking the best technologies from each. Artists experimented with them, but there was nothing new and dramatic in terms of the technology to create art. And as far as impact, think about what we see today in architecture dealing with decorations. In fact, think about theaters in the 1920s and how theatrical the decorations were. A lot of that type of decoration stemmed from the Baroque era and the experimentation done with building decoration. The Mannerist era led into the Baroque. Mannerist era pioneered a lot of these strange and novel things, sort of tried them out and experimented with them. In the Baroque era, artists started to apply those in very dramatic ways in all forms of art. Let's take a look at the school of Annibale Carracci. Carracci, it wasn't really a school in the sense that people went someplace to learn something. It was a school of thought. In this school of thought, we primarily focus on the rules. The purpose of the art was pretty much as it had been in earlier eras. It was to create decorations for churches or to create decorations for wealthy people based on classical themes. One of the rules here was that everything was beautified. In this type of classical art style, nothing ugly was represented, and even things that might have not been too appealing in real life, like the crucified Jesus, was painted in a very beautified way. Also, only holy figures or ancient classical themes are valid in true art, according to this school of thought. And brushstrokes should be really fine and preferably invisible. So an artist would work in the style of very fine brushwork, and it was a mark of the perfection of the artwork that the brushwork couldn't be seen. Also, if you take a look at a painting by Carracci, you'll notice that the light is pretty much as it would be in a studio. It's very controlled. There are no harsh contrasts or shadows. It's as if the lighting could be controlled so that everything was rather subdued and nothing harsh contrasted with the attempt to beautify everything. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, the school of Caravaggio, that is a school of thinking that originated around Caravaggio in the early 1600s, was everything should be painted naturally, even if it's flawed or not beautiful. Here, the saints were painted as sweaty, laboring men, and they didn't have fine clothes. A still life done with a bowl of fruit, some of the fruit might be rotten or have blemishes on it. And brushstrokes didn't need to be finely crafted or hidden from view. In fact, one of the early techniques, impasto, for layering painting on very heavily, probably had its origins with Caravaggio in that era. Also, intense light contrasts are a hallmark of this school of thought. And if you look at some of the paintings by Caravaggio, you'll notice that the contrast between light and dark, it's as if a very vivid light might be shining on one end of the painting, or on the objects in the painting, casting shadows on the other objects. As far as the technology, once again, we're talking primarily about painting, and oil painting had been well developed. What about the impact of this? The impact of this era actually was felt around 200 years later. with the rebellion that occurred in art in the 1800s. It takes its origins all the way back to this time. Caravaggi's school of thought was in rebellion to the classical school of thinking, where everything was done in a very fine way, as the school of Carracci would think. Now let's take a look at the Dutch art genres, which developed in the late 1500s. What happened here was that since a lot of the Netherlands became Protestant, artwork for churches kind of diminished as a market for artists. And one of the purposes of various kinds of art genres that developed was to decorate the homes of ordinary people. So at this point, various artists started to come up with ordinary life scenes or still lifes, landscapes, seascapes. All of these started to be regarded as valid subject matter for art, as they hadn't been in earlier classical times. And the technology, once again, was pretty much similar to that used in earlier eras as far as painting goes. Oil painting was really taking hold. The impact was pretty significant. It legitimized the broadened, valid content of art. And that's really pretty important, because that's a precedent that carries on through all the way to the present time. Now, I've lumped together two categories on your USF of historical painting and moralizing painting. These two are rather similar in a way. Historical painting documents a significant historical event. That's the purpose of it. And one of the primary rules of it is to make things as accurate to the events and places as possible. The Gombrich text, The Story of Art, talks about John Singleton Copley and a painting he did in Parliament, where it describes the research that he did as to what the room looked like and the period dress and where people stood and the actions they took at a rather historic moment. So that's just an example of the artist trying to make the historic painting very accurate, almost like these days we would consider a historical documentary. Moralizing painting was pioneered by William Hogarth, and in his case he came up with the Rake's Progress, one of a number of works that he did. The purpose was to show how bad behavior ultimately caused a bad result. That is, the rake, a person who sort of fell into debauchery because he inherited some money, eventually winds up in an insane asylum, and he damages a lot of people along the way. So an ancillary purpose, to tell a story about life, not necessarily a religious story. Now, both for historical painting and moralizing painting, the technologies, once again, art formed with oil paints was very common. The impact on modern life is a little harder to describe. For historical painting, that was a style that sort of came and went. And when photography developed, it really sort of waned. Moralizing painting, in a similar way, once a story was told, I mean, how many stories were you going to tell with a series of paintings? So neither of these really has much impact on modern life, except to the extent that it also broadened the kind of art that was considered valid, the kind of subject matter that was considered valid for art. Now we come to the Enlightenment, a period of time from around 1750 to, perhaps we can say it's even going on now. It's an era associated with scientific thinking and the attempt to rationally come up with explanations for things, as opposed to thinking that illness is a result of God being mad at you. They discovered germs using a microscope and understood that germs would cause sickness, and other types of illnesses were related to various kinds of diseases of the body. A lot of scientific explanations for planetary phenomenon. But that's not what we're focused on here. What we're focused on here is, during the Enlightenment period, what happened with art. And it turns out that what happened in the Dutch Netherlands during the Baroque, with the development of scenes of life that would appeal as decorations for households, was one of the major developments here. So one of the purposes of art during this period was to depict scenes of ordinary life for an emerging middle class. Another rule that appeared was that subject matter didn't have to include grand sorts of things like Greek or Roman themes, monarchs or aristocracy. Much more ordinary subjects were permitted in art. Technology, once again, nothing quite new happened. it was pretty much oil painting used by artists. The earlier mediums of egg tempera and to some extent watercolors were overshadowed by oil painting. The impact, kind of a field from art, but think about the Enlightenment era as ideas of humanism and the inherent rights of ordinary people. Now, these things actually laid the groundwork for revolutions in France and America that challenged the divine right of kings and the rule of the church. But think about this in terms of how artists living in that era, with the loosening up of subject matter, might have been inclined to paint pictures that depicted nationalistic themes or themes that might have, in some sense, fostered thinking about a different way of organizing society that might have been in keeping with revolutionary themes. That's one impact that I think we can attribute to the Enlightenment era. Romanticism is an era that follows the Enlightenment, and it's really a rebellion. It's a rebellion against the rationality of the Enlightenment. In the Romantic era, the purpose of art with Romantic artists was to evoke emotion and drama, and this in rebellion to the rationalism of the Enlightenment. So a rule associated with this is that imagination and emotions are valid sources of inspiration for art. In this area, literature also took off into emotional themes that had not been explored in literature before. Another rule was that it really wasn't necessary to follow academic rules of art in order for the art to be valid. So in terms of the themes being dramatic, and in terms of the way they were painted, this affected artists in terms of how they rendered artwork and considered it to be legitimate. Now, classical thinking still would have rejected it, and that, of course, comes to an impasse in the 1800s when the Classical Academy rejects this type of art, yet other artists are pioneering in different ways and actually popularize something along those lines. You could also say, once again in an ancillary way, that the impact of Romanticism was to infuse some artists to illuminate political revolution with their own perceptions of individual dignity and rights. So some of the artwork we talk about in this era actually is emotional in a way that is intended to curry the emotions of people who might already have a revolutionary bent. And lastly, we come to Impressionism. Impressionism really breaks open the door to a whole new way of looking at art. This is the point at which the Classical Academy loses its hold on what people consider valid art. Up until around 1860, although there had been some rebellion to the conservative outlook of the Academy, artists still wanted to be a part of it, to have their artwork shown at the Paris exhibit, and thereby qualify as art that was legitimate for wealthy patrons to buy. But in the 1860s, some of the artists who started pioneering in different types of renderings of subject matter, and even the different choice of subject matter, became a powerful enough influence to have an exhibit of their own. And this continued in the 1860s. Finally, in the 1870s, some of the art was reviewed by art critics, and one of the pieces by an artist that pictured the sunset, or the sunrise, I've forgotten which, was called just an impression, just a sketch, and that word impression stuck. So Impressionism became the name for that. So Impressionism became the name associated with that form of art. Now, something about the purpose of this, and this is radically different than the purpose in earlier times, art was purely a way for the artist to express himself or herself and their interpretation of the world. This is kind of what we think about artists today, and it started around 1870. Another rule, paint what you see, not what you know is there. So that painting outside, a technique called plein air, meant that you painted outside, making use of the technology that had become available with synthetic paints and pigments, new colorants, new colors, very vivid, but also portable, so you could buy them in tubes and you could take them with you out into the field, the landscape, where people were gathering, street scenes. You could have the paints there. You didn't have to have somebody grinding paints along with you to make up the colors that you wanted to use. So you could paint what was there, including harsh contrasts and shadows and various kinds of things that would have seemed distracting in art in earlier periods. it doesn't sound too far-fetched to understand that some of the rules were to throw out rules, that academic rules of color combinations, fine lighting control, careful brushwork could be ignored. Not only could subject matter rules from the past be ignored, but the way that you painted things could be ignored. You were pretty much on your own to invent ways that you want to do it, and any content is valid for art. Those are some of the rules. I already mentioned one of the technologies involved with synthetic pigments that derived from chemistry, organic chemistry research that was really intended to create dyes for clothing. And as a spin-off, the same pigments could be used for colorants for artists. Not all of them worked out entirely successfully, but some of them did. And those led into the pre-made pigments, the pre-made colorants and paints that artists could then buy and take with them into the field. So these, as well as traditional pigments, became commonly used. Another technology is photography. Photography developed in the 1830s, and it really took off and developed throughout the 1800s, so that by about 1870, it was pretty common to be able to take pictures of things. And soon thereafter, snapshots and Kodak cameras became even more common. So it is pretty apparent that some of the composition of paintings of the Impressionists after around 1870 seem to have been done with the idea that a snapshot wouldn't necessarily be composed in a traditional way. Why should a painting be composed in a traditional way? Perhaps some artists even took pictures of things and then used that as a way of composing a painting that they created. The impact of this is really significant. This opened the door to modern abstract art movements. After about 1890, other art movements, Art Nouveau, for example, and a lot of abstract art that took hold after 1900, the reason that people would accept this was that Impressionism had pioneered this departure from classical standards for art. And that's one of the most important legacies of the Impressionist era.